Okay, good evening, everyone. Everyone for joining us today for this session, our talk with Padraig Hyland. He's the CEO of the Core Story, which is an internationally based storytelling company. Thanks, Padraig, for joining us. It's an absolutely delight for us to have you at this session.
Great to be here, Shruti. Thank you, and Justin for inviting me along. I'm looking forward to the chat today.
So are we. Thank you so much. I'll quickly run through some basic rules today evening. We will try and keep the videos off of the participants, and we'll just keep the videos on for the host as well as the speaker, Padraig himself. Sorry for the inconvenience, but can you please turn your videos off? We're just going to try and avoid some distractions. There's going to be a question answer session. We talk with Padraig for about 45 minutes. And after that, last 15 minutes is for the question answer sessions. The audience can come and ask their questions and Padraig will be happy to answer. So, thank you so much, everyone, for understanding. So Padraig, we know that you are a CEO of an international company. You have been a stand-up comedian and you have been a TED Talk speaker. Quite an interesting journey. We have also seen that your core story has a mix of performers. You are a performer yourself and business individual. So how did this core story happen and what was your thought process behind doing this?
Yeah, well, probably. So my background is I would have worked within international business. I worked in Asia for 10 years. I worked in America for years. I worked in Europe for years. And then in my late 30s, I went off to find myself, as you do, when you don't have a family or a mortgage and you have that as an option. But I tried to do a few different things that I just never had time to do because of my corporate career. And one of those things was stand-up comedy. And I ended up trying it, and then it just turned into something, and I became a professional stand-up comic. And over the years, I learned a lot of things. I learned how to tell stories. I learned how to handle an audience, lots of skills. But one of the things that struck me as I was doing it is how some comedians are a lot more successful than others. And it wasn't necessarily to do with their material. It wasn't to do, some guys or girls would have great content, but their delivery might be great, yet they'd get across, or sorry, they wouldn't do so well. But what I found is the people that were being more authentic, regardless of what their content was, seemed to have a much better connection with an audience. And so what I really learned coming out of comedy was many different skills, but the one insight, if you like, that I brought away was if you want to engage and excite an audience around your business or your idea, you need to be telling a great story, but you also need to tell it from an authentic place. And so that's the basic insight that our entire business of the core story is built on, is authentic storytelling, because that's what makes leaders and organizations more effective at connecting with an audience.
Absolutely. It is, absolutely. So like we see that, core story, you try and identify the core story for every organization. So how does that work? How do you really go about identifying that core story for every business? And how does this core story get implemented in various different legs of the organization and various departments of the organization? How does that work?
So we would work with organizations to establish their core story, and really what we do is we establish a collective story. So in other words, we go in and we help organizations figure out what their authentic story is based on talking to a number of people within the organization and establishing a collective ambition. What do you care about? What's your purpose? What's your passion? So these are all what I would class people orientated. And we call this establishing your heart strategy. And then we craft that into a story. So in other words, most organizations have what they call a smart strategy. This is the bit where this is how we're going to win in the market. This is how we're going to beat the competition. How we're going to do better for our customers. And you need that. You need a smart strategy. But these days, your strategy is as good as your ability to engage people around it. And for that to happen, you need to have a heart strategy and have that built in to your strategy. and create it as a story, have a strategy story. And then that permeates, that story is used for not just marketing or internal, it literally is almost like it's like a compass, it's a guide. It helps you make decisions as well as communicate. So we would help organizations establish that story and that authentic story. And then we embed it by, quite often we would work with organizations at the same time on storytelling skills. We call it story enabling the organization. We do some skills upgrade, but we would also look at how they can perpetrate that story or permeate that story throughout the organization. And that's quite often done through a number of activities to create a space for storytelling to happen and to drive the story we want to drive. And it's an interactive process. It's not about pushing out the new story. It's about engaging people with that story. And that starts with when we're even creating the story in the first place.
That's interesting. So you're saying that, such stories really bring out the culture of the organization. And that's the culture that is, I think, implemented for.
Yeah, exactly. And if you think about it, like the stories exist already. Every organization has a culture, for example. Well, if you want to assess an organization's culture, what you're really assessing is what's the story the people in this organization tell each other about what it's like to be here. That's what the culture is. And that's so one of our points often is if you want to impact culture, if you want to energize culture, energize the story. That's how you do it. But spend time in establishing what that story is. And one of the things we would do with organizations quite a lot is making sure that the senior management, so the culture story, the core story, if you like, needs to be established by the board, not by the marketing department or the HR department. Now, they definitely have inputs, but the board needs to own your core story. And if it's done there, it comes out of the board. In other words, strategy leaves the board in a much better format, in a much better condition. It's in a story already. And by the way, all the board members are connected to it emotively. Now it's not cold corporate communication. It's an exciting story that people care about already. And that's much more easy to work with if you're a marketing department, a HR department, or anybody else in the organization. So that's our approach, if you like, and that's how it gets permeated throughout the organization. How it gets.
And there's consistency all over.
Yeah. Well, when it's done well, one of the things a core story should do is it should bring clarity, alignment, and authenticity. They're the three things we look for. If the strategy story is coming into the organization, it needs to be really clear and simple. It needs to be aligned across the organization, so it can't represent just one group. And it needs to be authentic, credible, but also from a place of passion, inside out. Lots of organizations, when they look for their story, they're looking out the window. They're like, oh, what does the customer want to hear this year? And then and it's insight based. It's smart, but it's not authentic. And if you can get both of them, you can get smart and authentic, or smart and hard. That's a really powerful combination.
Yeah,
that's fascinating. What would happen, like, if the company is young, it's like a startup, it's not more than a year old, and the company they tell you, for example, to get our story in place. Do you work towards a desired story that we want to tell, or where do you begin?
Interesting. Well, it's smaller organizations in particular. There can be a lot of cloudiness because they're working on business plans and they want a USP and a clear value proposition, and they've all sorts of stuff telling them different things on what you should or shouldn't be doing. And what happens is you get lost. Get lost in all. You kind of forget who you were. Why did you start the business? So quite often with smaller businesses, we look in certain areas for their story. And sometimes it's their founder story. Particularly with small businesses, the advantage you have is usually there's a founder or a small group of people that have a strong sense of what the company is about. So they tend to be quite sticking to the core, the essence, their authenticity. Not always, but they tend to be clear. In large organizations, there's so many people involved. such in terms of diverse markets and organizations and geographical difference, etc. It's really hard to get one picture. But the struggle with the smaller businesses is that they get distracted and they get pulled away from why they set up the business in the first place. But their why story, and often the core story is your why story, but not always. And so quite often for smaller organizations, we would work with them. We establish the first part of our process is to establish what they care about, what their passion is, what their purpose is, and what's their ambition. And then we start to craft, and we do this using story, by the way. We don't sit anybody down and say, tell us what your ambition is. We sit down and we ask them a certain set of stories from which we will elicit their ambition. Because the beauty of using story is in discovery is that it bypasses the filters the mind puts on. You know, if somebody asks somebody a question and they already start filtering, oh, what should I be saying? So if you can use story to establish what somebody really cares about, what their ambitions are, and in particular, if there's a group of them, you get a collective ambition, collective care about. That's when it becomes really valuable. And then you establish their story that way. But with smaller organizations, we often, there's a couple of little tips I say, go back to why you founded the company is usually a good idea. A story of, you know, a value that you bring to the world or to the consumer or the customer is usually, they're good places to look for ideas. And quite often, which is a great, I had an incident once myself, which was very valuable. I was out to dinner one evening and there was a lady sitting opposite. And it was one of those moments, you know, somebody asks you a question just as you're putting like a spoonful of food in your mouth. And I literally put the spoonful of food in her mouth as she was finishing the question, which was, so tell me, Padraig, the core story, is that like a PR agency? And I had this spoon in my mouth and I go, And as I was doing that, the lady beside her who runs a PR agency, but had worked with us, said, oh, no, let me answer. I'll answer because, Padraig, you're eating. And she said, the core story is the opposite of a PR agency. Because what they do is they help you figure out the story that is authentic to you and helps you understand how to tell that in a compelling way, as opposed to helping you find a story that might trigger a certain response from a certain customer group based on some insight. Now, she was being a little bit derogatory to PR agencies, I think, at the time, but she was one, and she was doing it with a smile on her face. But the reason I tell that story is it was actually a really good way of, in a nutshell, describing what we did. And so I often say to people, if you're trying to figure out what could be your good story, go and ask somebody that knows you well to say, how do you describe what we do to other people? Because in that moment, I kind of thought that's a really insightful way to describe our business. I'd never thought of it saying it like that. And so for smaller business, I often give it like, that's a good thing to go and ask some people, how would you describe, somebody that knows your business, how do you describe our business to other people? And you start to get a flavor how other people see you.
Interesting.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. I worked in a multinational advertising agency where the founder, fortunately, was a guy who wrote memos left, right, and center. He used to blast the whole office and all the employees with memos on how we should behave with our clients, and how we should write our create our advertising, and things like that. And the interesting thing is that whichever office, and this was a good 70 odd years back, and it's that the agency is that old, despite which the culture of the organization is pretty much consistent across the offices around the world. They might be speaking different languages, but you get the sense that, wow, we all belong to the same company because these guys behave exactly the same way, which is fascinating, which means that, you know, they're all telling the same story. I mean, so within literally months of joining the company, you are already speaking the same language and telling the same story, and you are part of the same story, you know, which I find fascinating. So, yeah.
So I was just going to just a point on that, because I think that's a really interesting insight. It's the story that people connect with. But I often use the analogy in a lot of organizations when they're trying to build their culture out, communicate here's our mission and our vision, and here are our values, and they've all this kind of really good communication. It's good stuff. It needs to be established, but it's like the ingredients to a cake. But the cake isn't baked. In other words, they're going to people and say, oh, here's our mission. Now, if I'm the head of the organization, or I'm one of the senior guys, I get that and I go, oh, yeah, it's really exciting to me. But if I'm a guy or a girl that's just joined in the last, couple of months, and maybe I'm a graduate, and all of a sudden I'm hearing all it has little relevance to me. It doesn't, I don't connect with it. And I guess the point I make is that a lot of communication within organizations is where senior teams are asking their people to eat the ingredients of the cake. In other words, they're saying, here, have some flour. What does that taste like? It doesn't taste good. Have some, whatever it is. Whereas story is like taking all those ingredients and baking them into a cake. Cake is tasty. Everybody wants a piece of the cake. Everybody loves cake. Everybody gets what a cake's about. So that's the analogy I use when I'm explaining to people why is story so important within organizations. Because we don't bake the cake. And story is what people really get excited about, not the ingredients. We like the ingredients because we're the chef. We take great care about the ingredients, and we should. But at the end of the day, we're the chef. It's not all chefs that eat the cake. It's people that don't care. They just want the cake. So that's my analogy. But if you get the cake right, to your point, Justin, you get the cake right, then everybody you don't even have to sell it. You don't have to push it. People will come for the cake.
That's so fascinating. I mean, when I hear you talk, and when I see stuff written in your website, you use words like passion and engagement and all those purpose and change. It's almost a religious experience that you're communicating, which is not far from the truth, because if you look at all your scripture, the ancient scripture, they were all oral storytelling, and what we are believing today and the way we are behaving is all based on stuff which was stories, which were oral in the beginning and then written down. And if stories are that powerful, I find it ironical that businesses are still so slow to engage with stories and utilize stories, to the extent that it could be utilized.
Well, I think just a couple of things on that. So I think businesses are getting better, as people are waking up to it, and about time. But there's still a lot of it that's not happening. There's still a lot of corporate communication. I think a lot of it is just, I don't know who made the rules, but I think when the world went towards mass communication, it was all about pushing out. It was all about the message. It was all about the efficiency in getting a message out. And therefore, it became less about the listener, the person that's receiving it. Now, communicators are waking up, and businesses are waking up to the fact that, yes, of course, there's a message, but it's more about the experience now. How do you make somebody feel when you communicate to them? How do you get them to want to listen? And you've almost got to assume that they don't want to listen. Where in the old way of communicating, the assumption was people will just listen. But that's not what happened. And so people are realizing, actually, we've got to work to get people to listen. And if we're going to do that, we have to deliver something that engages them, that excites them, that they can connect with. And that you've got to do through the story. So I think that there is an awakening of that. And I think also within business, if you look at a lot of the key initiatives, like there's a big move towards customer experience. Well, the only way you can establish a customer experience is through a story, because that's how a customer experiences, because they're human. So if you look at culture, we talked about it earlier on. If you want to impact culture, what you're really doing is impacting the story of what it is to be around you. So people are waking up that story is highly engaging of human beings. And so it's at the center of all human experience and all human interaction. So people are realizing, oh, that makes it really important, but it also makes it really effective. The other thing is that it's beyond just communication and connection. Story is how you make meaning of things. As humans, that's how we make meaning. So therefore, if you can change the story in somebody's mind, you've changed what it means for them, to either experience your product or your business or whatever. And you can't change what happens, but you can change what it means. And that's the power of story. So and like I say, we use story a lot in discovery. We use story to establish what actually is going on here in a culture or during a change or whatever. You don't go and ask somebody what's it like around here. Go and ask them to tell you a story about something. You get a lot more information. So story is, in actual fact, the way we view story is we think of it as a technology. And you use the technology in a lot of different ways, but it's a technology that drives meaning. Think of it that way. And if you think of it that way, it opens up a lot of doors to you. And that's what we enable. We talk about when we work with leaders, we're enabling them to access their own story so they can engage better, but also use story to connect with others. Even when they're not using their own story, any story. So there's a lot that can be done with story if you upskill and become more aware of it.
Padraig, you spoke about leaders and about telling authentic stories. I think leaders would find themselves being vulnerable to being authentic because it means sometimes displaying your weaker side of times when you missed out, you messed up, and got up. How does that work? I think because they need to continue to put on a brave front and all of that.
Yeah. So it's a great question. It's a great question because it's interesting. We have a 13-week program we put leaders through, and it's an amazing. It is a bit. You mentioned the religious experience. It's a bit of a transformation program for people, because what leaders find out is who they really are, what they really care about, but also how they're seen by others. And the gap is quite interesting sometimes. But a lot of the process is about getting them to understand actually what do they really care about. Forget the nonsense. Forget the fact you're a leader. Forget you've been a degree in this. Just you as a human. What do you really care about? What is your actual purpose? And what happens is there's a lot of acceptance, believe it or not. There's a lot of people going, actually, yeah, that's actually what I do care about. And then there's a lot of permission given. In other words, during the program, we're getting people to accept who they are and giving them permission to go do, to come from that place. But doing it in a way that they can see there is no big, it's not about taking a bold, daring move. It can feel a bit like that, but it's done in a way that the actual program is designed to take them out the other end of that, where they actually get to see when they communicate, this is how you should communicate. These are the stories you should be telling. This is how you should engage with these people. So it's kind of a whole program. And I think that's the journey of any great leader, is towards authenticity. It's about being more human, but it's going back to stand-up comedy. The great stand-up comedians, you name me any one of them, they had a clear and distinctive voice. They knew who they were. If you look in business, even think of any leader you admire or was really successful. They have a clear and distinctive voice. They know who they are. So that for us is the power. The story is a real part of that, because you find out who you are through your stories. And so story is still very much a part of that. But it's a really powerful place to get people to show up as who they are. It can be brave, but it's a really empowering thing. It's a very exciting thing.
It's so fascinating. You spoke about culture and you spoke about leadership. I mean, this whole story business appears to be transcending across all of organization. I've got to ask you about sales, because sales is the one area where, if I tell the right story and it works, I walk out with the money. And if it does not work, I'm walking out empty-handed. Tell us a little bit about how storytelling works in the sales situation.
So storytelling works in a few different ways, but just like anything, it operates at a couple of levels. At a basic level, if your organization has a clear story about who they are, then when you're connecting as a salesperson on the phone or in a meeting, an authentic place. And in particular, if you as a salesperson are connected with that. And that's part of the process you as a salesperson should do. You know, there are people that go out and sell a product they don't believe in, or work for an organization that they don't believe in. But you've got to find the belief, or else get out of the product if you have that choice. Because an audience senses it. So whether your customer will sense if you're not authentic. This is the power of authenticity. They sense when it's there and they sense when it's not. So that's the first thing. If you like, the overarching story needs to be right about what you're selling and the organization you work for. And there are sometimes gaps. Sometimes people, you know, we would work with a lot of marketing agencies that you're past, Justin. And sometimes people say to me, but sometimes I'm pitching an idea and I don't believe it. And I'm going, okay, I get that. But there probably is something in the idea you do believe in. So maybe you don't believe the idea works for this, but you probably do believe in the way it's being rolled out or that. So connect with that. Find a way to connect with it is the first thing. So you need to be connected in sales. You will be far more effective if you are connected and emotionally connected in some way to the company and the product. But it doesn't mean you have to love it to death, right? But you have some connection. And then the second thing is you need to appreciate when story is a great way to, as I said before, discover. So we would work with sales teams and we help them to elicit the stories that give them the information they want. So rather than asking a client a specific question, you ask stories, because within the story, there is so much information, valuable information, if you can elicit the right stories, depending on where you're at within the sales pipeline as well. So at different points, you elicit different types of stories. That's a really important aspect. And then secondly, there are stories you tell. You know, in the early stages, we're very good at telling case studies of how we help the business do amazing things. But quite often the case studies aren't delivered in story format. They sort of have a story structure and they have a linear structure, okay. They're not really stories. Whereas if they're converted into stories, that just means a bit more work on the structure and things, they're far more powerful. And then knowing what stories to tell and when is really important, so that you can, build confidence, build really good relationship. So it's not about being devious or manipulative. It's about having an authentic connection and having a rich, authentic connection through the story.
Yeah, that is beautiful. Completely fascinating. Shruti.
Yes. So we've been hearing a lot about storytelling being implemented in the organization. How about giving us an example about one of your clients or some of your experience that you've had wherein you've gone through the entire journey of first identifying the questions, then the identifying, and then actually rolling it out to the team. And what was their reaction about you being able to identify that core story?
Well, I'll give you a couple of maybe flavors of kind of what it looks like. So we a couple of months back, I remember we had an instance where we had spent 4 months working with an organization, and we spoke to a lot of stakeholders. We did a lot of discovery, and our process is like a lot of processes. There's a discovery process, and then usually at that point we'll be able to highlight things where there is a lack of clarity or an inauthenticity or a lack of alignment, and we kind of work through things on that, and then we come back, we go back around, we talk to maybe some of the customers or consumers as well, we get them involved. So there's a lot of going back to the stakeholders, and so it's got a whole process. But the interesting thing was when we presented the story, so we ended up doing a written story. It doesn't always have to be in written format. We usually at some point write a story, but sometimes it could be in video or something else where we deliver the final core story, shall we say, or it might be in several formats. But I remember delivering it to this organization, and there was silence. They read the story, and there was just sheer silence for a couple of minutes, and we're going, "Oh my God, what does this mean?" And but actually, the response they gave in the end was, "We've never described ourselves like this," and they were kind of almost in shock. And I said, well, do you not like it? Do you not feel it represents you? And they're like, no, it's amazing. It's like, it's got this amazing, you captured who we are and who we have been, but you've also given us this feeling of where we're going in the future and our relevance and that. And so that's the kind of reaction you want when you deliver your story. But I'm going to talk about one particular company. And the reason they came to us is because they had a story. And this is an important thing. There is no company that doesn't have a story, company or leader. Your story is out there. The only question is, do you know what it is? And is it the story you want it to be? And so this was an organization, and they were an international organization. They were a social enterprise, actually, but they worked a lot in education. And they were renowned for going into big companies and taking old computers, reconditioning them, sending them to countries in Africa and other places, and putting them into schools and creating these kind of technology-enabled labs within schools. And it was amazing. And it's a great story and a fabulous story, but they'd had one problem. It was about 20% of what they did. There was a whole lot more work. This company was in the business of technology-enabled education, basically to change how people learn, how children learn. That's what they were in the business of. But all anybody ever talked about was, oh, you recondition computers and you send them to Africa. Now, that story was limiting them because they are a social enterprise. They relied a lot on maybe funding from organizations. However, if all anybody ever heard was you recondition computers, all anybody wanted to do was give them computers. Nobody wanted to give them cash so they could expand the amount of schools they were implementing. And by the way, a lot of the computers they implemented were brand new. So, like I say, it was only a part of their business. And so we worked with that organization. And I remember the CEO at the time, we worked with what we call the big story, the narrative. And then usually we try and find an anecdote that nails the essence. And we worked with this CEO, and at the end of a day workshop with the senior team, we were chatting and we're sharing stories, and he told a story that just nailed the essence of what they were about. So we had the big story that had values and mission and vision and all that stuff. But this was that anecdote that really punched you in the face. And here's the story he told. He said, we were driving through Africa, going around to a few of our schools to kind of review how they were getting along. We're in Kenya, we're in the middle of nowhere, we're thirsty. And we saw one of those kind of mud huts on the side of the road. It sold like orange and water and very basic. I said, so we stopped the car and we all got out and we're standing around the hut and we're having a water or a fruit juice or something. And there was this mother there surrounded by 3 or 4 kids. They were all on their bare feet. It was a mud hut. They're all happily running around. We got talking to the kids and we discovered that they were going to a Kamara was the name of the company, a Kamara-enabled school. And we thought, oh, great. And we started to chat to them about it, what it was like learning online. And then there was this girl there who was, I think, about 11 or 12. And he turned to her and he said, and so what are you going to be when you grow up? And she looked him in the eye and she said, I'm going to be a neurosurgeon. In her bare feet in a mud hut. And then she told him why. And there was no doubt in her mind that this was possible and within the realms of her capability. Absolutely none. And that story delivers exactly what this organization is about. They're about creating a child in Africa that has that opportunity and that sense of belief. How else do you do that? So it's a powerful story. And the CEO told me subsequent to that, they were on a radio station being interviewed. And the interviewer was going on about, oh, and you recondition computers, and that's brilliant. You upcycle and you recycle. And the guy said, yeah, but we do all this other stuff as well. But it's amazing how you can recycle those computers. I mean, that must be so wonderful. The guy couldn't get him off. And then eventually he got this story out in the interview. And as soon as he did, he described that the DJ interviewing him just kind of went back in his seat and went, oh my God, I just got what you're about. And he said the whole interview changed. And so that's the power of story. That one little anecdote that they had identified, which had the essence of what they're about in it, is often the most powerful thing you have in your arsenal. So that's just a couple of examples maybe of the kind of work we would do, or how it kind of works. In terms of permeating it throughout organizations, usually when we're developing the story, we also develop a plan with the team. And that's it can be quite a detailed plan on how the story is propagated. The thing we do insist on, though, it has to start at the top. The board and the senior team have to be involved. This is not an initiative that is driven from somewhere, halfway down the organization with somebody with the best intentions. It does come from the top, but a lot of bottom up input.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that story, because if you would have not shared it, I would have asked for the story. If you would have left us hanging that was a beautiful story, I would have probably, typically what the story does, it leaves you wanting for more. So that was amazing. Yeah, thank you so much. So now that we know that you've identified with this organization one core story about what they do, and it has defined beautifully what they really do versus the myths the other people had. What happens to the other stories? Because like you have collected so many stories, people have individual stories about how they've grown in the organization, their interaction with the customers, or internal stories. Do you think they too are important, or they somehow lose their...
They're absolutely important. And you're not coming in with a new story and sweeping away every story that exists. What you do, so in every organization, thousands, millions of stories exist. We all have a story. We'll have a story about this interaction we're having now when we come off the call. So they all exist. What you're really doing is finding a story and trying to make it dominant. So it's not that you make all the other stories go away. You just make all the other stories come into line with your main dominant story. That's really what you're doing. I'll give you a really good example. I spoke recently with Ken Allen. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he used to be the CEO of DHL International for 10 years globally. And he took over the organization when they were losing something like 700 or 800 million a year. I can't remember the figure. They were losing a lot of money. And he took it over, and within a very few years, brought it to great profit, like in a very short amount of time. It was an incredible turnaround as a business. Now, he did a lot of things to do that, very smart decisions, but he also made some good heart decisions. And one of the first things he did was he launched a program which they call the CIS program. But basically, it involved putting all of the frontline staff through 100,000 people globally through an extensive retraining, if you like, or a training program to certify them as international specialists. But also, one of the key things he did was they accessed the origin story. He found some of the key people that were involved in setting DHL up. A guy like Po Chung in Hong Kong, who was jailed because he set up DHL, which was competing with the Postal Service, which was illegal at that time. So he accessed all these people from the history of the business, how it was founded, and he got them to tell their story. And that was shown as part of this program he put everybody through. So what he did was he was reconnecting everybody with the origin story. And then also within that couple of interactions or within that process, they also connected with today's story and a lot of stories therein. So what they effectively did, among other things, was it connected people with the origin story and got them to kind of tell what the new story was. But the origin story was part of it. So it was really a great, powerful initiative to kind of get everybody onto the same story, to connect everybody. And he did a lot of other things as well, but I just think that's a really great way, and it might answer that question of, it's not about doing away with other stories. It's about, embracing them, making them part of who you are, but then clearly establishing the new story as the dominant story. But this is where we're going, if you like. Vision story dominates.
Sure. Absolutely wonderful. I have to ask this question. We probably thought we might not bring it up, but then I have to ask this question. Business is all about intense stories and serious stuff.
Yeah.
I heard your TED talk, and you spoke so wonderfully and brought in such good humor there.
Yeah.
What has been your experience if you think that you are trying to bring in humor in business kind of communications, and how has your client reacted to something like this? Because it's a very powerful, engaging tool. You have
Yeah.
people in your pockets if you have made them laugh.
Yeah.
So what
Yeah.
is your take on this?
Well, the challenge with humor in business is that it takes a little bit of bravery, because everybody feels it's not good business. Oh, if you're being funny, then you're obviously not professional. It's like on this side there's professionalism, on this side there's humor and fun. Whereas that isn't how it should be. Obviously, I don't believe so, but it is a challenge. There's a lot of people think it's not appropriate, and you have to be aware of that. There are times, obviously, when humor is not appropriate. If I'm downsizing the organization, I'm not going to do it with a funny story. But I think there is great room for humor in within business, and I think storytelling is a really good way of doing it, because it's not about trying to write funny gags but I think you can bring humor into a story, and any story usually has a character, and you can put a bit of dialogue in, and it doesn't have to be hilarious, but it is lighter, it is more humorous. And I think that's important, and I recommend people do that. We to be honest have to watch ourselves, because a lot of our businesses are corporate, and we can work with like public sector. Some of those organizations can be very kind of conservative, and we try and bounce in with our joyfulness, and sometimes it's just not appropriate because it just doesn't work with the culture. But we try. So you're always trying to find the point where you can get a little bit more humorous without losing them, without getting them to feel that you're, not being professional or whatever. But it is a challenge.
Break the ice, maybe.
Yeah.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah. But like we have been told to tone it down a bit by organizations. So and I take that on board. In some instances it can be quite humor is usually quite good, but in some instances if you're kind of too humorous, and people just feel that you're undermining your credibility in some way. I believe it's the exact opposite. You have to have a little bit of situational awareness. And the other piece of advice I give is that don't try too hard with humor. Don't push humor. It's got to be, like I was saying, it's got to be authentic. So trying to take something, a joke somebody else tells, or a line from somewhere, and trying to push it into your stuff may not work. The best thing you can do to bring a bit of humor in is tell a light story from your own. Sometime you did something silly, or got caught out doing something or whatever, and tell it from that space rather than try to be funny, to try to be something.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful session. So we are into the last 15 minutes of our talk. I would like to ask the audience if they have any questions for Padraig. We have some questions that have been sent to us in advance. Ravi, are you there? Yes. Ravi, do you want to ask your question? You want to unmute yourself or turn on your camera, please?
Hi, Shruti.
Hi,
this is Ravi. I'm not properly dressed for the occasion because I thought we are not on the video. So
that's okay.
That's okay, Ravi. I just imagine you're in a pair of shorts.
Exactly, you got it. The COVID uniform. Yeah, I'm actually basically into international marketing. I think my question was related to that. I think you mentioned in the last 2-3 minutes back, you don't try to, when you're having a business conversation, you might not be wanting to inject a story, because one is the credibility of the seller might go, and the buyer might not take us seriously. But a certain amount of humor always helps. This is what I feel, because this is how, when they're evaluating 4 different vendors, they know the guy who told the funny story. Let's interact with him. Somehow they remember in that manner. And this happened in few instances in my sales career, in the international marketing career. So, but definitely it should not be like it has to be a plugged in story or plugged in comedy or joke or something. Should not be. It should go along with the flow. And I agree to your point that if it's from a personal experience, it looks more authentic and it will fit in like a dovetail joint, other than rather bringing out a joke from a rugby jokes book and planting it.
Yeah.
So, but from your perspective, do you think international contracts are dealt mostly, the finalization is done by the heads of the state or the ministers or the presidents or the prime ministers? Some of the, especially you spoke about Africa. I had a lot of dealings with Africa. Most of the high value contracts are dealt by, are finalized by the president and the prime ministers. Their storytelling might not be you might not have an opportunity to do that. How do we find a way to get ourselves injected in such circumstances?
So Ravi, in those environments, I think you're describing an environment where, the key decision maker ultimately isn't in the room. And therefore, how do you kind of work around that? And the answer in a lot of cases is making sure that you give the person you are talking to the story that they need, that they can go and deliver to that decision maker. And so it's about understanding what that story could be and telling it from the perspective of it's a story that would appeal to the president or the minister, as opposed to maybe the administrator, who might have a slightly different view of the world and therefore might appreciate a slightly different story. But if that person is going to then have to go to the minister or whoever and persuade them, the more equipment, the more things you can give them to make that easy. And the story is the thing that will be easy to remember, but also probably have the biggest impact. And so it's actually an environment where you need to use story even more, but it's just being aware that it's about equipping the person to go and share that story.
Yes, thank you. I think basing on the experience and the situation, we need to put our story across.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So we have a question from CB Hari, and he says, does body language, both physical and tone, play a vital role in storytelling? Or how important is body language?
Yeah, well, it's very important, obviously. We are big on the idea that you can't separate the story from the storyteller. You embody the story when you tell it. A lot of storytelling that happens in business is done from the narrator's perspective. In other words, we tend to step out of the story. Even if it's a personal story, we'll step out of it and we'll describe it from a distance. And therefore we become a narrator, and therefore our body just stops moving. We lose a lot of the expression in our face. Our hand movements go away because we're now just a narrator. I might say, well, when you go into a coffee shop and you notice there's always somebody wearing an apron and they ask you the same question or whatever it might be, whereas if you go, last Tuesday, I walked into the coffee shop in Starbucks and this guy in an apron came up to me. In other words, I'm in the story. So the tip I give people is, yes, absolutely. You need to bring your expression, your movement, your energy, use your voice up and down, what you would do telling a story to friends. You need to bring that into your business storytelling. And the best way to do it is to make sure that you stay in first person, that you tell the story from in the experience rather than getting out of it and describing the story, shall we say, and narrating.
Fantastic.
Okay, the next question, Rama, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, hi Shruti.
Hi, Rama.
And hi Padraig. No, I think my question was adequately answered no doubt, that lovely story about the NGO, and I'm with the social sector. So it really, I mean, I know that happens. So that was quite a good story. But I had like one more question coming up, which was like, we are not looking at leadership within the social sector so much in that sense. We work more like a team. Practically everybody is on the same level. There is nothing like, oh, there is I mean, there might be a CEO, but it is not so much like the vision comes down from somewhere up, and then you have to like, it's mostly teamwork. How do you like, really, if I am thinking of a story and my, say the head of the NGO is not thinking of it, how do you like negotiate that space?
So, well, if you're establishing a story, we call this thing the collective view. So we look for a collective purpose, a collective view of what we care about as a group. So some people in the group might be more ambitious than others. But what you end up doing is, if you do it collectively, you land in a place where everybody's comfortable, everybody feels connected. So what we care about, well, there's lots of different things that you care about. But in a group, lots of different people would have care about slightly different things. But what you do is you work through the stories until you find some themes that are universal, that you can pull into your core story. So the way we get around that is by getting a lot of people involved, maybe, and eliciting a lot of stories from a lot of people, and then using that information to land on the authentic story, rather than just one individual.
Right. Thank you.
So, thank you,
That
Rami.
reminds me of the fact that, if you're looking for one good idea, the best trick is to have a lot of ideas and then filter out which is the best idea.
Yeah.
So I think that trick can work here. Good. Thank you, Rama. Thank you so much.
Shruti,
Okay, so moving.
Shruti,
Yeah,
Chris,
sorry.
Chris has a question.
Okay.
Chris, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question? And we'd love to.
Yes, hi. I'm calling from Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. I just wanted to find out, it strikes me that storytelling may be viewed rather subjectively. We all almost innately know that storytelling is important. Two of the greatest storytellers I know are Jesus and Mother Teresa. And but has any scientific studies been done? Any sort of empirical evidence on the effectiveness of storytelling in business?
Yeah. There's lots of work done around. I'm trying to think if I can think of a good one off the top of my head. I'll email you maybe afterwards. But there has been a lot of work done around story in business and just story in general, and the effectiveness on its ability. And there is some scientific research around on its ability to engage people. So there is a lot out there. As a matter of fact, you wouldn't have to Google too much to find it. And I think one of the key areas, or one of the interesting areas for me, is there's a couple of things we reference quite a lot, which is around the parts of the brain that are excited when you're storytelling. In other words, when people are communicating facts, you tend to get one or two parts of the brain excited, usually to do with comprehension and language. Whereas when you tell a story, several parts of the brain, because people get into the story, they can see the sights, they can smell the smells almost, they can hear the voices. So all those parts of your brain get fired up. So just the very fact somebody tells a story is immediately more engaging, because it triggers a lot more of the brain. And then there's a lot of interesting research. There's a nice little piece of research called the significant objects experiment. And that's, if you do a little Google on that, you'll find it. But it was a simple little thing where a couple of guys, they spent $125 on knickknacks, kind of rubbishy things that you want to get rid of in your house usually, but lots of little things, maybe for 99 cents and $1.50, and they just bought a load of stuff. I remember one of them that I often use an example. One of them was a horse's head, just like a plastic horse's head. They bought them on eBay, and then they put them back up on eBay to sell them. The only difference is they added a story for each item.
Mm-hmm.
And the horse's head, I think, was bought for 99 cents or something, and it was sold for $67. I might be out a little bit.
Mm.
The only difference between the first time that horse's head was on and the second time was the story.
Yeah.
So they were the experiment, and I think they spent, like I say, $125 on stuff, and they made, I think, 8,000 or something, 6,000 or 8,000. It was a ridiculous amount of money. Now, of course, they probably had to pay people to write stories, so it wasn't, but they were demonstrating that story changes meaning, it changes the value of something. So there is really nice research experiments like that are out there as well that demonstrate the value of story.
Yeah, if I may just share a little bit as well. My brother owns a teak wood furniture factory in Indonesia, and it's made in a little village outside of the city of Yogyakarta. And the company was doing well, but you're right. The moment we added a story behind it, that it came from this little village, it was made by this craftsman who has a family of 4 children, and this is his house, and this is his motorcycle, and things like that. It was so much easier to sell. People bought it just because they could relate to where it came from and who made it and things like that.
Yeah. Well, it's on the sales side. It's going back to Justin's question. Like, when people buy something, what are they buying? Well, they're buying the story in a lot of cases. It's not that. Yes, there is a product. But often it's the story they're buying. They're emotionally buying. Yes, their product is actually what they buy.
Yeah.
Just
one more little question, if you don't mind. Just when you have a change of management, change of owners in a company, do you find that the stories change, the storyline changes, or at least the theme changes? And have you seen examples yourself where it has a direct impact on the success of the company?
Yeah, well, I think the example I give with Ken Allen and DHL is an incredible example of that. But it happens all the time. I have the story within the organization will directly impact performance. The one that comes to mind, I remember a couple of years ago working with an organization that had grown very quickly through acquisition, and at the board level, the talk was grow, and then they were going to sell on. They wanted to grow quickly, flip it, sell it on. And they bought 3 or 4 acquisitions. And I remember they were a business in the logistics area. And I remember talking with one of the supervisors in one of their warehouses one evening. And he was talking about how they were growing, and they were going to flip it and sell. And I remember asking him, well, how do you feel about that? Like, what does it mean to you when they sell the company? And he said, well, nothing. I'm not going to get anything. As a matter of fact, I'm a bit worried because I don't know who's going to buy us. And are they going to just grow us? And what it demonstrated to me was that the story that the board had was all over the organization. The story about grow the business. Let's make a lot of money. Let's flip it and move on. There was no story about the organization. There was no, that should be the main story. What are we doing? What are our products doing? How are we growing, evolving? How are we getting better? How are we adding value to the world? How do we take care of our people? It's an example of where the wrong story was being permeated by a new management team that came in to grow the business quite aggressively. And that had a big impact on the business's ability to grow. So there's loads of stories like that. I could talk all day of stories where both positive and negative impact based on the story.
Fantastic.
But of course, I'm the storyteller, so for me, everything comes back to the story.
Yeah. We have a question from Dorcas Lim. Dorcas, I think you're from Malaysia also. We've got a handful of participants from Malaysia. Dorcas, you may ask your question. Unmute yourself, please, if you're there. No.
Maybe gone. Did you know what the question was, Justin?
No.
Or
No. She
Let
addressed.
me check. One moment.
Okay. Tony Lau is raising his hand. Tony, would you like to go?
Yeah, hi.
hi, Tony.
I'm Tony Lau from Penang, Malaysia. What you were talking about, the organization, etc., and you were talking about smart strategies plus hard strategies, right? Well, I certainly believe in what you're saying there, because one of the things about a buy-in to a particular story is um, hitting the emotions that relates to the individual and the story. And when you do that, literally it burns into the individual's mind and they remember it. Now, I don't think you are shaking your head and saying you're nodding, so I presume you're agreeing with me.
Yeah.
So the question I wanted to hear what you have to say about is that if you have a large organization, most organization talks about smart strategies, right?
Yeah.
What they want to do, etc., etc. But the hard strategy is difficult to pick up, especially if it's a large organization. Because it occurs to me, every department and every individual in the department may have a different perspective of how the hard strategies links to his or that individual's emotions, right? And I guess it becomes very difficult to consolidate all of this into one nutshell and one shot hits everybody.
Yeah.
So I figured that there should be other ways of translating this story telling process in order to translate the smart and the hard strategies that relates back to the individual, and therefore possibly you'll get better participation and better contribution from the people that work with you in the organization.
Yeah, that is the challenge. The challenge is, how do you land on a, like we say, a core story? It's clear, it's concise, it's all of these things, but does it appeal to everybody then? And it's an interesting process, and it is doable. And it's a lot of what we do is exactly that. We get a lot of people to connect with one story. But the way it's done is you elicit stories from a lot of people, but quite often you can chunk things up. So you might have a number of people that care about slightly different things, but that there's a universal theme in there. So I just recently, a couple of months ago, we were working with an organization, and there was some very strong characters that had sort of, oh, I care about this and this, and they were what on the face of it looked like they care about different things, but the unifying theme was that they both had a strong desire to do the right thing. And I remember when we progressed through the process with this particular organization, that was one of the things that popped up as the universal theme, if you like, that people cared about. So it might have been expressed in slightly different ways and might have been, acted out in slightly different ways. But there was a universal theme there, if you like, that they could all buy into. So that became one of the aspects of the story. Does that kind of answer your question, Tony? Does that kind of demonstrate what I mean?
Yes, to a certain extent, but I still feel that once you pick up the universal theme, you probably will have to translate this theme to each individual, let's say heads of departments, right?
Yeah.
Whom will know how to connect the story to the individuals that work with him, and be able to translate that information and link to the emotions related to these individuals. And so that brings me to the point where uh, uh, probably there is an opportunity to actually train and teach these individuals, these heads of departments, if you like to put it, how to translate that universal theme, that hard strategy, and that smart strategy all in one to the people that work with them.
Yeah, you're right, Tony. The way we work is we when we're doing our core story process, there's always an upskilling of the senior team in particular and key people within the organization. There's an upskilling in storytelling and story crafting and using story and story doing, shall we say. So the other aspect of the story, usually when we get involved, it's to craft the new story, the vision story. So it's about the story takes us through a transformation or the next stage or whatever. And so you need people to be able to connect with it, and you need people that can, as you say, work with others to help them connect with it. So usually there are a series of workshops where we can enable the leaders to manage that rather than us do it. Sometimes we support, but it's very much about story enabling the organization. In other words, they not only get the new story, but they get how to use story to support culture, to drive different behaviors, all of these things. And so they become story enabled, story capable as well. And that's a really powerful thing when both of those happen. But it leads then to what you're talking about, Tony. It means that everybody engages in the story. You know, everybody should be able to see themselves in the story. That's really important.
Agreed. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony.
Excellent. Shruti, shall we ask one last question? We've got a question from Reena Bhattacharya. She says, in big organizations, does the story that percolates from top to bottom remain the same, or do perceptions of people listening to the story impact or cloud the real story? Do the people's story cloud the main story that's meant to percolate down?
Yeah, so what you want to do is, so the percolate down, yes, but it does have some input from down as well. It's not just done up here and then, but then it's signed off with maybe up top of it. But what you want to achieve is a core story that is in stone. There's core elements that do not change no matter who you are. But then it's surrounded by what we call a lot of connecting stories. So the connecting stories are thousands of stories. They're everyday stories that deliver on some aspect of the core story. And those you want to propagate those. So they're the everyday stories, the things, and they're people's little interpretations on the core story in their own language, in their own way, through their own experience. And that's what you want. So the core story becomes a reference. It's like your compass. But it's not like, oh, everybody has to be saying this story. Everybody needs to know this story and connect with this core story. And then they go and propagate their own stories, their versions of this core story. That's when it really comes alive. It's not about constraining people. It's about enabling people. Connect with this story and then make it your own, in your own way. And that's so it's not about diluting it as such. It's actually more about starting a fire and letting that fire go.
That's right. Yeah.
Are there any more questions from anybody? Any more questions, please? We are sorry. We're 10 minutes ahead of time. We would like to close in case nobody has any questions. Nupur, do you have a question? Yeah, sorry. Justin, you have a question? You're on mute. We can't hear you.
Hi, I'm Nupur. Just my question was, I'll rephrase my question. I just wanted the speaker to just give us some new tips, because I am in the middle of starting a new company. It's my first time, and it's an e-commerce company. So if you could give us some tips for relating, storytelling to brand establishment.
Sorry, storytelling to who? To who?
Brand establishment. It's a new brand coming into a competitive, e-commerce platform.
Okay, so my guess is you're moving into a space where there's lots of competition, and
Yes.
it's like anything, the key story you want is your value story.
Yeah, because the competitors are, the whole world is talking about passion, misery, bringing out people who are working on your product. So how to be different? I gained a lot from your session, that we have to look at a difference in the story. smaller things, smaller differences, newness in the participants. But still, if with your experience, if I can get some tips on, writing my brand story.
Yeah, so the thing, it's about looking for your differentiator, but trying to find it based on your passion and purpose. That'd be the first thing I'd say. Be really clear on that and don't lose that. So what you want to do is get a great balance between your passion and purpose and what the market needs. But start with passion and purpose. Start there. Don't look at what the market wants and think, oh, I'll give them that, and then craft your story around that. You start with your passion and your purpose. What do I care about? Why am I starting a business? And define that story. That's the first story I would try and define. Why am I starting a business? What does it mean to me? So in other words, don't answer the question of what my business does. Answer the question of why is it important that this business exists? And then secondly, what does it mean to me?
Okay.
Why do I feel passionate about this? If you answer those two questions, you will get a really good insight into what your story should be about.
Okay.
And so, and I'll tell you, in particular, when you're starting out, and maybe you don't have a lot of case studies or recommendations, or your biggest advantage is your story. I'll tell you a quick story. I had a client of mine who invests in organizations, but he only invests in organizations between 2 and 10 million. He doesn't want to hear anybody that's looking for an investment less than that. And every time I brought him a smaller company that I thought was really good or interesting to his business, he'd go, no, too small. And then one day I saw an article in the paper where he had invested in a small company. And I went to him and I said, oh, hey, what's this all about? I bring you a small company and you tell me to go away, but you go out and you invest in this small company. And he said, oh, I met this guy at an event and he told me such a good story. I had to invest. And this is a hard-nosed investor. He's about business. He's about results. He's about performance. This guy met him, told him a great story. And the story was about why he was doing what he did. So find that story. That might be your biggest advantage when you're out there speaking.
Okay.
And so hopefully by answering those two questions, it'll help you land on that story.
Thank you.
I might just add that, your business might be similar to a lot of your competitors, but your story will not be similar. So that is your distinguishing factor. So, yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sure. Anyone else before we wrap up? Justin, we can't hear you. I don't know why you've lost your voice.
We know.
Hear me?
Yeah, now.
There you are. There you are.
Welcome back. No, we lost you again.
It's a conspiracy.
No, we can't hear you. You might want to disconnect your headphones for now. From the laptop.
No, nothing.
We can't hear you.
We need a good lip reader. I think
you might want to write on the chat what you want to say. Okay. In the meantime, while he writes to us, any other question, any last questions?
Hi, Shruti, can you hear me?
Yes, Ravi, I can hear you.
Yeah, sir. Yeah, sorry again, thanks for this, giving the opportunity to speak again second time. I have a small question, quick one. What about startup companies who don't have a story to tell? How do they start that venture, and how do they get hold of some promoters, and what story they should be forming up? This is not for me, but this is for my daughter who is trying to do this.
Well, it's probably a little bit like the last, like Napur, in that you start by identifying the story of why should this business exist, And then secondly, why do I care about it? So get your daughter to answer those two questions. Why should this business exist? And why do I care so much about this? So, and the answer, by the way, it might have nothing to do with what your business does or the customer or anything. It might be just personal, but that in itself, your passion point is a great point of credibility with other people, as well as being highly engaging. So that's why that's a good place to start when you're new. Obviously, you need to have details on products and other things. Like, it's not the only thing you talk about, but you can engage people really strongly just from that platform if you have no previous business.
Yes, thank you so much. I think that's a good point. Maybe you have to re-strategize her business, yeah, in that format. What you mean to say is the passion which counts, which brings results.
Yeah,
and promoters.
Well, in particular, when you don't have a lot of experience, you don't have case studies, and you don't have maybe established products or a brand, it's your story is the only thing you have. And so your passion story is one of the most powerful stories you can have.
Good. Thank you very much for the tip. And
Okay,
nice listening to you once again. Have a good evening.
You too.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you. Justin has just written to me saying that he wants to know about the interesting mix of people that are there in your organization, coming from art, music, theater, and so forth. So is that like a deliberate mix, or it just so happened?
No. It's very deliberate. So examples would be, we have some improvisers, comedians, actors. We have a stage screenwriter. One of our people, Sheila, she writes musicals and screenplays. So, but they all have some business experience. Or one of our voice coaches, she's an actress, and she's also used to be a teacher. But so we've got some journalists, some broadcasters, and then we've got some really hard-nosed strategy people as well. So it's a mix. But I guess the idea here is that, I guess the insight, if you like, that our whole business is built on is in the fact that in the world of business today, people aren't listening. That you have to adopt that as your paradigm. People aren't listening. So therefore, you need to communicate in a way that gets people to listen. The people that communicate to people that aren't listening are performers. Because if I put on a show or a movie, I have to persuade people to come, and it has to have high value or people will leave. And so that's why we get that mix in. We want all that skill set, we want that know-how, we want that experience, but we want it in a business context. So we're not teaching people how to sing their presentations or anything, but we are bringing in story and improvisation skills and performing skills, and we're weaving them in so that leaders or people in business can be as engaging and need to be as engaging as a performer without performing such.
To be able to grab the attention, attention is difficult to grab these days.
Very, very. And story is the go. And the other thing I'd say about story is the work we do with story, with upskilling people as well. In a lot of cases, everybody has the skills. We're all very, very capable storytellers because we're humans, and that's how we communicate, how we make sense of the world. But what we end up doing is just making you consciously aware of the skills you already have, and then show you how to use them in business. So we're not actually teaching you. A lot of our work, it's just people going, oh yeah, I do that. Oh, I never knew. Yeah, so so I should do more of that. Yes, you should. You should, because that's good. So a lot of it is about just, bringing that awareness to people and giving them permission to go and use it. It is often the upskill they get in the process.
Sure. We'll take the last question. Randall, you have a question?
Randall.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I was in a session that we were challenged to write 2 or come up with our own stories, 2 a week.
Yeah.
Is that realistic? Because that was 6 months ago, and I did it one time, and then it just dissipated. So how do you recharge yourself to be so creative?
So, firstly, was it a creative story thing you were doing, or was it just a story?
Yeah. It was, well, it was in a business context, but it
Yeah.
was pretty much getting people to listen. Yeah.
Okay. So the key trick is to recognize a story. Now I know that sounds maybe silly, Randall, but for example, you've kind of given me an idea of a story you could tell already. You, for example, have a story about a time you went on a course, you learned something, but when you left the course, it was really hard to keep doing.
True.
Now, there's a story in there that you could tell. So tick, we've just discovered a story. So the trick here is about identifying stories. So in actual fact, you could come up with 2 stories an hour if you want. You, Randall, personally could do this if you just switch on your awareness button for stories. So everything is a story. There, you now have a story about coming onto a call with a question about stories and the guy on the call telling me about stories, and then I could go away and figure something out. So everything is a story. People coming on this call, just before I came on the call, my Zoom decided to update. So I wanted to be on like 5 or 10 minutes earlier, and all of a sudden I'm scrambling around trying to get my Zoom. So that's a story about how if you leave things to the last minute, they might go wrong. But so it's everything is a story, and also, Randall, the recognition that the best stories are sometimes the most simplest, mundane stories. I went down to the newspaper, stand to get a newspaper. But on my way down there was a dog. I'd never seen this dog on my street before. Who is that dog? Who owns that dog? I couldn't see it anywhere. I'm just making up a story, but it could be something as simple as that.
Does it require a certain amount of courage to find people to listen to your story? Do you need an audience to do a good story?
No, you don't, but you need to know what a good story should have. And I'll just give you very quickly the basics. So it needs a structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end. But it also needs a conflict. Every good story has a conflict. And that's why even a small, simple, everyday story can be a good story, as long as there's a conflict in it. So I just made up a story there. I went out, I was heading out for a newspaper. I was walking down my street, and there's this dog. I've never seen this dog before. Whose is this dog? I've just created a conflict. I want to know who's the dog. It's a dog on my street. I've never seen this dog before. Oh my God, it's snarling at me. This is a dangerous dog now. This dog shouldn't be on the street. I've discovered it. So now I'm getting all, I've got a conflict. So I look him down. Does anybody know whose dog this is? I asked a few people, whose is this dog? Nobody seemed to know whose the dog was. And then I, asked a few more. And then I got to the newspaper stand, and there was this old lady going, "Oh my God, I don't know where he is. I don't know where. Well, what's wrong? Oh, I'm looking for my dog. Is that him? Is that the dog?" Now we have the climax. We're resolving the conflict. It's a simple little story. So everything has when me coming on here, I'm going on to my call. So the setup of the story is I'm going on a call. I'm going to do it, but just before I go on, my Zoom goes, "So you need to do an update. It's collapsed." I mean, I go, "Oh my God!" So now the conflict is: will I get on the call in time? Will I be late? I'm meant to be speaking. Conflict. It's a simple story. I was going on. I had to get on time. I was a little bit late getting on. But in actual fact, if I tell it well enough, I can heighten the conflict. Oh my God, I really wanted to get this right. This is a storytelling one. I love storytelling. I don't want to let the people down. I'm heightening the conflict. So it's a simple story, but provided I have certain key things in it, you could 10 stories a day, Randall, 20 stories a day, no problem to you. You don't need an audience to find stories. They're around you every day. You just need to switch on your little switch for conscious awareness of them. So,
well, thank you. Yeah.
Anyway,
quite an interesting question. You made us all listen to an interesting conversation. Thank you so much. Okay, that brings us to the end of our session. Thanks everyone for being a wonderful audience. Thanks for being such a great coach of storytelling for all of us. We learned a lot from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all, and thanks everybody for your questions. I really appreciate that, and for tuning in. It was an absolute pleasure. If anybody wants to kind of reach out LinkedIn or drop us a note anytime, If we can help, we're more than happy.
They can get your email from us. You just need to contact
right.
either Shruti or me, and we'll let
or
them
maybe
know.
you can just type it on the message in case you want to leave it to them.
Oh, yeah.
I'll do that. I just want to make sure I get everyone. I'm glad. There we go. Yeah. So it's easy enough to remember. Padraig at thecorestory.com, and I'll just spell story right. Yeah, and then like drop a LinkedIn or something.
Absolutely.
Also, it's
brilliant.
So LinkedIn is a great way to connect. We all connected on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
So,
and we put some resources and stuff up on LinkedIn regularly, so keep an eye out further. Or you can follow the core story as well on LinkedIn, and again you'll get some when you're coming toward.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Guys.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Have
everyone.
a great week. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.